Well, Donald Trump's red necktie friends, who Alex was just talking about, came to the Manhattan Criminal Courthouse this week to praise one of the criminal defendants in the building and to attack District Attorney Alvin Bragg, who Donald Trump falsely accuses of spending all of his time and resources on the prosecution of Donald Trump.
It's for People versus Harvey Weinstein. We are moving forward in that matter. We intend to retry it, and for those of you who are in court, saw that the court set sort of a window for a trial in the fall. So we are already moving forward with that matter, having conversations with survivors, centering their well-being, and pursuing justice. We are here now because the work of the office goes on in so many ways. As those of you who cover the office know, the breadth of our work, and that work continues. We have the expertise and resources to take on tough cases while driving down crime alongside our law enforcement partners. That includes, over the past 2 years, driving shootings down 48% in Manhattan, murders down 17%, burglary down 31%, and overall index crimes down 7%, outpacing the citywide decline of 0.6%.
And that is but a tiny sample of the work that District Attorney Alvin Bragg is doing every day with his team of more than 500 prosecutors handling more than 35,000 active cases every year. If those Republican candidates for vice president really support law enforcement, they would have come to New York to congratulate Alvin Bragg. Just when you thought a presidential debate that includes Donald Trump couldn't become more ridiculous, it has. President Joe Biden will be debating Donald Trump with one hand tied behind his back, legally. Donald Trump will be in the debate studio, will be claiming that every criminal prosecution Donald Trump faces is being run by Joe Biden. Donald Trump says that every day. Everyone has heard that before, and we will hear it again on the debate stage, and the moderators will do nothing to contradict that because, in their traditional view, that will be Joe Biden's job. Debate moderators will use the standard playbook of allowing the other candidate to answer accusations made by the opposing candidate. But what will Joe Biden be able to say about the prosecutions of Donald Trump? Maybe nothing. Because presidents not named Trump never comment on pending criminal cases. Prior to Donald Trump, the most famous and possibly only instance we had of this was when President Richard Nixon said in 1970 that Charles Manson was guilty of mass murder in the Hollywood Hills of actress Sharon Tate and 7 other people.
I noted, for example, the coverage of the Charles Manson case when I was in Los Angeles. Front page every day in the papers. It usually got a couple of minutes in the evening news. Here is a man who was guilty, directly or indirectly, of 8 murders without reason.
The problem was Charles Manson wasn't guilty yet. President Nixon said that in the middle of the Manson family trial. The Manson criminal defense lawyers immediately asked for a mistrial because of the president's undue influence on the jury. Nixon made the statement just before boarding Air Force One in Denver to fly back to Washington, and as soon as the plane landed at Andrews Air Force Base, White House staff issued this written statement by the President of the United States. To set the record straight, I do not know and did not intend to speculate as to whether the Tate defendants are guilty in fact or not. All of the facts in the case have not yet been presented. The defendants should be presumed to be innocent at this stage of their trial. The next day, at the defense table, defendant Manson held up for the jury a Los Angeles Times headline saying, "Manson guilty, Nixon declares." The New York Times reported, Superior Court Judge Charles Older took immediate steps to forestall a mistrial by questioning the jurors individually about whether the incident had prejudiced them. All but one of the 12 regular jurors and 6 alternates testified that they had witnessed Manson's action, but they all said they could act impartially. One man said he hoped he could. Just before the session ended, Judge Older also sentenced a defense lawyer, Dae Shin, to county jail for 3 nights on contempt charges for putting newspapers on the counsel table where Manson could get at them. And the judge asked each juror to swear under oath that they would be able to reach a verdict based solely on the evidence presented in the courtroom. Joe Biden remembers the 2 days in 1970 when the President of the United States almost derailed Charles Manson's murder trial. Everyone in high school or older in the United States at that time remembers it. Joe Biden is a more careful person and a more careful lawyer than Richard Nixon. Joe Biden has not said anything about the overwhelming evidence against Donald Trump in the criminal charges that he faces for violations of the Espionage Act and illegal possession of classified material. Joe Biden has said nothing about the overwhelming evidence in the indictment of Donald Trump in Washington, D.C. for a conspiracy against the United States of America, a conspiracy to defraud the United States of America by illegally changing the results of the presidential election. Joe Biden has said nothing about the criminal charges Donald Trump is facing in Georgia, where Donald Trump was recorded on the phone demanding that the Georgia Secretary of State change the vote count in the presidential election. Any other candidate running for president against Donald Trump could attack Donald Trump in a presidential debate on every one of those cases, as long as that candidate running against Donald Trump were not the president of the United States. News coverage of Donald Trump has worn out the word unprecedented. But here we are tonight, at the end of a full day of news coverage of what will be the Biden-Trump debates, and the news media still hasn't even realized how unprecedented those debates will be this time because of the criminal indictments facing Donald Trump. There will be a nominee in the debate facing at least 3 indictments who will already have been convicted or found not guilty in an earlier trial happening now in New York City. If there is a hung jury in the Manhattan trial and the district attorney announces that he is going to pursue a retrial of Donald Trump on those same charges, then Joe Biden won't be able to talk about that case either. A so-called debate that was already going to be ridiculous is going to be even more preposterous. It will be the theater of the absurd. Joe Biden won't just have one hand tied behind his back. He will be put in a legal straitjacket. And the unfair benefit to Donald Trump is enormous. Joe Biden is a good lawyer who could rip up Donald Trump in a debate just talking about the criminal indictments against Donald Trump alone. Instead, we will see the latest version of the standard TV debate format, which is already problematic to the point of absurdity. I've seen every televised debate in presidential history. That's how few of them there have been. Most presidents were elected without debating anyone. That's how unnecessary presidential debates are. I was a little kid sitting on the floor of the living room in Boston watching the very first televised presidential debate between Vice President Richard Nixon and that Boston boy, Senator John Fitzgerald Kennedy. I was in college the next time they had a presidential debate, 16 years later in 1976, between Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. Televised debates are not a mandatory part of presidential campaigning. They are a show created by and for television. They did not exist before television. No one thought they were necessary. The historically famous Lincoln-Douglas debates were not presidential debates. They were debates for an Illinois Senate campaign, which Abraham Lincoln lost. The television version of debate doesn't actually test presidential skills. In the rooms where presidents govern, they are never told. They only have 2 minutes to respond to what someone just said in that room. Presidents never have to make decisions alone. Presidents always have expert advice available to them, as much advice as they want or need. No one has ever run into the Oval Office and said, Mr. President, you have 30 seconds to respond. Never. And they never will. Nothing presidential is actually being tested in the phony debates that the television industry pretends are invaluable because they're really good for the television industry. Candidates standing there alone on a debate stage answering questions about how they will govern is an entirely fictional television construct of how presidents actually do their work. You don't need to remember everything about the tax code or the throw weight of missiles, the Social Security trust funds all the time when you're president. If a president struggles to remember a name or a number in the Oval Office, no one snaps at him, no one panics, no one thinks the president is losing it. Every professional working with a president, a serious president, knows that every president not named Trump has the largest range of governing information and responsibility in his head of anyone in that room. Everything from agriculture policy to the latest terrorist threat. If the FAA director comes into the Oval Office to talk about the stress of overburdened air traffic controllers, the FAA director expects to know and should know a lot more than the president knows about that particular subject. That's why he's there, to help the president. But if, say, when the FAA director is walking into the Oval Office, he sees the CIA director leaving, the FAA director should assume that she's talking to a president who might be distracted by something much more serious and darker that he just heard from the CIA director than what the FAA director is now there to discuss. But the televised presidential debate turns on the childish notion that the president is supposed to know everything all the time about everything. And he is supposed to state the most important points about everything in 2 minutes to an audience that has a tiny fraction of understanding of what a knowledgeable, serious president knows. What you want is a president who can think. And they almost never have to think quickly. So you want a president who can deliberate and think carefully. And they absolutely never have to think alone. What you want is a president who has demonstrated the ability to find the best choice in the agonizing presidential situations of having no good choice. None of the presidential debate moderators, all of whom are very good at their work, have ever seen a presidential decision made. They have never been in the room where that happens when it happens. They have never seen a presidential decision on its way to being made. They have no idea how many weeks or years of thinking by the president and the people around him shaped that presidential decision that is announced to them in a White House press briefing. That is in no way a criticism of the moderators announced today for the CNN debate and the ABC debate, each of whom will definitely do a better job than I could ever do in that situation. But there is nothing the moderators can do to fix the conceptual flaw in the very notion of televised presidential debates. The flaw that was there at the birth in 1960 when the television business decided to pretend that the presidential debate could actually be a window into how the potential president would actually do his work. Joe Biden started all this morning with this.
Donald Trump lost 2 debates to me in 2020. And since then, he hadn't shown up for debate. Now he's acting like he wants to debate me again. Well, make my day, pal. I'll even do it twice. So let's pick the dates, Donald. I hear you're free on Wednesdays.
That was at 8 a.m. And then 2 hours and 14 minutes later, at 10:14 a.m., Joe Biden announced, I've received and accepted an invitation from CNN for a debate on June 27th. Over to you, Donald. As you said, anywhere, anytime, any place. Half an hour later, Donald Trump accepted the June 27th CNN debate invitation. And then an hour later, Donald Trump posted on social media his accepting a September 10th invitation for an ABC television debate. 2 minutes later, Joe Biden officially accepted the September 10th ABC debate invitation in a tweet. The Biden campaign laid down a set of conditions for debates this morning. The debates should be one-on-one, allowing voters to compare the only two candidates with any statistical chance of prevailing in the Electoral College and not squandering debate time on candidates with no prospect of becoming president. The moderators should be selected by the broadcast host from among their regular personnel so as to avoid a ringer or partisan. There should be firm time limits for answers and alternate turns to speak so that the time is evenly divided and we have an exchange of views, not a spectacle of mutual interruption. A candidate's microphone should only be active when it is his turn to speak to promote adherence to the rules and orderly proceedings. Good luck with that. And congratulations on the big win. You had endorsements through your position as county executive there, in a county, by the way, that's bigger than some states in population. But you also were outspent so massively and still were able to pull this off.
Yes. Yes. Thank you so much for having me. Yes, it's a wonderful feeling. It really is. It's been a wonderful day.
What do you expect to be the most important issue between you and Larry Hogan in this campaign?
Well, you know, there are many policy issues. I think the issue of choice is the one that I hear most about. You know, I have an 18-year-old daughter, and like so many, I am so concerned about her right to privacy and freedom, the right to make her own decisions about her body. And this is an issue that is, by the way, not only important to so many women, but this is also important to men, fathers and grandfathers who want their daughters to have more rights than their mothers and grandmothers and not fewer. So this is one of the issues that I believe is going to be a seminal issue in this election, although there are many others. The Supreme Court is an issue as well, who we would appoint there, sensible gun legislation, economic opportunity and what that looks like. So there are many, many issues, but I believe these policy differences will be really the issues that divide us. And I think ultimately Marylanders want to keep the Senate blue.
And Larry Hogan, who has had his differences publicly with Donald Trump from time to time, if he's in the Senate as a Republican senator, he would be doing everything that majority Republican Senate could do to support Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think this is absolutely right. I mean, we saw that Mitch McConnell was the person who invited Larry Hogan into this race, saying that it was the get of the year. We also know that Larry Hogan would be voting with this caucus. In fact, he has already shown himself to be a person who does not support choice, a person who vetoed important legislation that would have expanded abortion care in the state. And we know that he will be voting with this caucus, with the Republican caucus, which, by the way, in a party that is led by Donald Trump.
Well, you are now targeted by Republicans because they have high hopes of winning that seat in Maryland so that they can get the majority in the Senate.
Yeah, well, you know what? This is a state that I have built a very strong grassroots coalition across the state. I've enjoyed talking to voters where they are all across the state, talking not only about my own record, but talking about a positive vision for our state. And I'm finding that the issues that tie us, the ones around economic opportunity, growing jobs and income, safe communities where people can feel safe and actually be safe in their communities. Again, the issue of choice and so many other issues are resonating with Marylanders. And ultimately, I believe that the policy positions that I have taken and the ones that are consistent with the Democratic Party are also consistent with the values of Marylanders. And they are going to vote, I know, to keep Maryland blue and to keep the Democratic Party in the majority in the Senate.